still waiting for Alan Whitehead to join, so hopefully he'll join us in the next 5 or 10 minutes and he can slot in when he arrives. Slight change of lineup that was originally advertised. Rachel Reeves couldn't join, and unfortunately we have ended up with a male panel, for which I apologise, that wasn't the intention. But we are where we are. So I'd like to start by introducing our panel for today's event. What is the role of hydrogen in a decarbonised world? So to my left we have Stuart Easterbrook, who is the Future Gas Strategy Manager at Cadent. To my right we have Mike Muldoon, who is the Head of Business Development and Marketing at Alstom UK. So some housekeeping rules. I've been told to let you know that there is a hashtag #PXHydrogen for those Twitter users in the room. Please interact with that if that's up your street. So I'll just give us a brief bit of context for today's event, and then we'll launch into our panellists and get their perspective. So I think for people working in the energy sector, I think it's increasingly hard to ignore the fact that hydrogen has crept back into the discourse of transition into a low carbon economy. You know, hydrogen is abundant, no CO2 is released when it's burnt, so technically it makes a lot of sense to use this in the UK and globally. But the concept of hydrogen economy is not new. It's been around since the 1950s. Indeed, the UK used to run on town gas, which was made up of a large proportion of hydrogen back then. So the concept is not new, but it's kind of crept back as we move to a low carbon economy and think about how we decarbonise hard to reach sectors such as transport, such as industry, such as domestic homes. And as part of this, the UK is trying to achieve a greenhouse gas reduction of 80% by 2050. And in achieving this target, a number of issues and a number of problems associated with this transition need to be overcome. So as I mentioned, how do you decarbonise these hard to reach sectors, and how do you integrate increasing amounts of variable renewable energy into the system? And this is where hydrogen has potential. But the pace of decarbonisation has been particularly slow. If you look at the transport sector, the pace of decarbonisation has been basically static. In industry, more progress has been made, but there's been a recent stall over the last couple of years, and emissions have actually gone up over the last year. And domestic heating, I think everyone knows, is kind of perennial policy challenge facing UK policymakers. How do we decarbonise domestic homes? I think that's a really pressing challenge where you'll hear from Stuart today about the role hydrogen can play in this. The other overarching feature is that the transition to a low carbon economy often suggests that we need to reduce dependence on natural gas grids. So what is the role of gas grids in a decarbonised world? This is kind of what's driving some of this conversation today, and this is what's really pushed hydrogen to the fore. If we can't use the gas grids in their conventional way, what are the kind of green gases that we could use in its place? My view, and others might differ, but we're going to need some form of gas to meet these winter peaks. If that can't be natural gas, could that be hydrogen? Some of these questions we'll hopefully address today. A shameless plug for me, I put a hydrogen report last week, so if I can draw your attention to that. Two of the big pressing questions that we raised in that are around the production side of hydrogen. This is kind of the big challenge facing the development of a hydrogen economy. Can we scale hydrogen production? Can we do it sustainably? Until that's the case, the kind of concept of a hydrogen economy kind of stands at the precipice. And then secondly, because the use of hydrogen is so interconnected in the energy system, you could use it in transport, you could use it in heat. Understanding where the most appropriate place to use hydrogen within the economy, I think, is another pressing question. So we need to take a very systematic approach to the use of hydrogen in our system. So with that, I'll hand over to Stuart for your take on what you've been doing in this space.
Thank you, Joshua. For those of you who may not have heard of Cadent, we operate 4 of the 8 gas distribution networks across England. So we do operate the gas networks in the northwest, in the Midlands, in East Anglia and North London. So we are a gas transporter. At the moment we are transporting methane, natural gas primarily, with increasing amounts of renewable biomethane. But we know that you can't carry on using natural gas in the way we are doing at the moment and meet both our carbon reduction targets, but also contribute to reduction in air pollution and support clean air. So that is the reason why the energy industry are looking at what the alternatives are for heat, but also transport and other sectors. There are lots of options, but we believe that hydrogen ticks the two key boxes here, which is policy decision is going to be made on two factors: least cost, least disruption. And disruption is about not just about digging up roads to put infrastructure in, it's to do with changing appliances, changing behaviours in homes, in businesses. So the solutions for the UK that support decarbonisation and clean air are going to be supported by least cost, least disruption. So the role of the gas networks, we see our role as supporting the policy as it's developed in large part by central government. So we see that role as filling the evidence gap where it needs to be filled, and to also show the potential of different projects and show that ambition, show what might be possible from different options, including hydrogen. And on the hydrogen front, there's a number of projects that we've been working on. We're working with the other gas distribution companies to see the implications of converting the existing gas network to hydrogen. But there's two specific projects I want to touch on. The first one is something called High Deploy. So this is a project where we are looking at how much hydrogen you can blend into the natural gas network without having to change any appliances. Now, we think you can get up to potentially 20% hydrogen that we could add to the existing gas stream without having to change appliances, and that can support decarbonisation. Now, that might not seem like a massive amount, but 20% of the total gas demand is actually quite huge. It's probably, to use an electricity equivalent, about 2/3 of electricity demand, because the gas delivers much more energy than the electricity network. So it is a large amount of hydrogen. And for me, the real potential of the High Deploy project is, if you want to pursue hydrogen, suddenly you've got a huge market that you can ramp up your supply chain. You can say to all the companies that believe they have efficient and innovative ways of making hydrogen at scale, it gives them a route to market. So I think High Deploy is a major opener and enabler to enable hydrogen to move forward. The second project is a project in the northwest called HyNet. So HyNet was a recognition that one of the big challenges of decarbonisation is how do you decarbonise heavy industry that's reliant on natural gas to deliver its energy needs. So we developed a project to build a hydrogen hub between Liverpool and Manchester to support that transition from industry in that part of the world across to hydrogen. So it would involve building the hydrogen hub, hydrogen production facilities, carbon capture and storage in the nearby gas fields that are coming to the end of their lives. But it was a project which was built on how do you decarbonise industry. But it also showed that when you start developing real projects in real areas, it changes the mindset of people. So we started off with a project to convert industry, but when we presented it to regional stakeholders, they said, great, love what you're doing with industry, but we need hydrogen for transport. Can you extend this project to support hydrogen production for transport? And that's what we're looking at now. So I think I'll just finish off by saying that we think hydrogen can play a large part in the low emission energy system of the future. But we need to start building stuff, and we need to start building stuff at scale, because that will change, it will demonstrate that hydrogen can be delivered safely, it will enable the supply chain to gear up and you can start driving down costs, and it will also change the mindset and you will start to see different potentials for hydrogen. A couple of other examples of that, I've mentioned transport. Hydrogen could also have opportunities for supporting renewables. But another area which we're starting to have conversations around is, can the nuclear sector support hydrogen production? We're all probably familiar with nuclear reactors to heat up water, to make steam, to make electricity. But could you also make nuclear reactors, if there's a massive hydrogen economy, to make hydrogen directly? If you start having a hydrogen economy, then you can start thinking about these sorts of options. So I'll finish off by saying, yes, we think hydrogen's got a large part to play in the future energy system, but we need to start building stuff.
Thank you. Alan has joined us. I'll jump straight to you if you don't mind.
Right.
Or would you like a...
No. That's,
Okay. We'll jump straight to you and get your take on hydrogen and how the Labour Party see the role of hydrogen in a decarbonised world.
Okay, well, firstly, hydrogen clearly has a substantial part to play in our future energy economy. However, the question is, how big a role might it play? Is it going to be a role that will require us at some stage to take national decisions about whether hydrogen or a change to hydrogen should be the way we go overall, or can we fit hydrogen into the energy economy in such a way that it plays a substantial role but not the leading role alongside a number of other technologies and arrangements. And I say that particularly in terms of what we are going to have to do about heat as far as our energy mix is concerned. And heat obviously is the Cinderella of the energy world. It's a subject that didn't even feature in departmental white papers until a little while ago, when the concentration in energy was all about electricity and electricity production and the details of how that would work. Heat was completely off the agenda. Now we've got a situation where we've made a lot of progress in decarbonising electricity. We've made virtually no progress in decarbonising heat. And we have a very serious question ahead of us about how we do proceed, because we've got to proceed in decarbonising heat in the not too distant future. And we've got to do that at a pretty fast rate. Labour, for example, has produced a policy for future energy, which is that on an industrial strategy basis we need to move to 60% of renewable and low carbon energy, not electricity, by 2030. So that probably means producing something like 80% of our electricity supply, 80 to 85% of our electricity supply by renewable and low carbon means, and 40% of our heat, which is a greater proportion of our energy requirements than electricity, by low carbon means at the same time. And at the moment, we are using only about 5% or getting 5% of our heat from low carbon sources. So it's a very considerable, substantial challenge. And that's one particular area where I see hydrogen playing a very substantial role. And I say that in two different senses. Firstly, there's the question of what it is that we're going to have to do about the gas that goes into the system at the moment. How do we decarbonise that gas? And the short answer is, most people have considered previously, we can't decarbonise that gas significantly. And therefore, in terms of heat, what we're going to have to do is electrify heat and basically chuck gas off the system, pull people's boilers off their walls, replace those boilers with ground source heat pumps, perhaps, and electrify the whole heating system overall in a period of time. Now, that, to my mind, is a fantasy in the end, in as much as the amount of electricity we would need to generate in order to replace what is going into heat at the moment in terms of energy would mean we'd probably have to triple the capacity that we've actually got in terms of generating electricity. And of course we'd have to pull up the entire gas networks at the same time, and the opportunity cost of doing that would be very considerable. My view is that we actually need to amend our gas system in terms of its carrying arrangements to domestic properties. Obviously, something like 50% of gas that we supply at the moment goes into generation, 50% goes into heating in various kinds. And the obvious candidate for decarbonising the gas supply one way or another, is hydrogen. And as it happens, you can inject hydrogen into the gas system as it stands to about 20% of the present mix of gas, so that you would have at that point a substantially decarbonised gas mix system. Now, one of the issues about hydrogen is it's got a different calorific value and space value than gas has, so you don't actually decarbonise in terms of energy the same extent that you replace in volume. So you decarbonise in energy terms of about 6-7% if you put 20% of hydrogen into the gas system. Above 20%, then you actually would have to start changing how the gas system works. And there have been a number of experiments up and down the country as to whether you could actually replace 100% of the gas system with hydrogen in the process of decarbonising heat. If you replaced hydrogen by 100%, you would actually need to make a lot of changes to the way boilers work and various other things, the jets and how that all functions. A number of experiments up and down the country, which you may have already heard mention of, Leeds 21 experiment, for example, and the Kiel experiment around Kiel shows that you actually can do that to 100% quite satisfactorily. It works quite well, but you have to make the changes to the system. So the question really for the future in terms of heat policy is, do you partly change the gas system by putting hydrogen in, or do you wholly change the gas system by putting hydrogen into the system, with the consequential changes you'd have to make to the system in the process? And that is where I mean that we might have to make particular national decisions at that point about whether we want to switch the whole system over, just as we did with natural gas when we moved from town gas to natural gas. Would we want to switch the whole gas system over from natural gas to hydrogen? My personal view is that that is not likely to be on the cards, and a more likely outcome is actually we inject a number of different green gases into the system, including biomethane, hydrogen, syngas, various other things which together would substantially decarbonise the system, but essentially keeping it integral as we go. So that's the first, I think, key point about where hydrogen could be of particular use in our system. The second thing I think where hydrogen could be particularly useful in the system is in the electricity generation process, acting essentially as a seasonal battery rather than a daily or weekly battery. One of the limitations, a lot of excitement about batteries coming forward at the moment. How can we bring batteries into our energy system so we can make much more efficient use of the electricity that we have? Batteries, however, can give you a lot of load shifting on a daily or a weekly basis, but they can't shift on a seasonal basis. If you had, let us say, essentially hydrogen stores, you converted your electricity into hydrogen for the purpose of storing that electricity on a seasonal basis, and then reconvert that back into electricity when you need it on a seasonal basis, that would give you your interseasonal shift on a much more effective basis. So hydrogen as a substantial use under those circumstances, I think, is very important. And we won't go into other uses of hydrogen. I personally think that we're never going to electrify our logistics fleet, for example, unless Elon Musk can prove us all wrong. It's unlikely that heavy haulage transport is going to be fully electrified, if only for the reason that probably that electrified transport will be hauling around the country mainly batteries, with a small amount of freight stuck on the top of the batteries at the back of the truck. Whereas hydrogen, not as a vehicle fuel, but as a logistics and transport fuel, could be a particularly good low-carbon solution in that direction. So I think hydrogen has a number of uses in the system, in specific areas of the system for the future, without us going to a full hydrogen economy. The one thing I would say, though, in all this, which undoubtedly will become a commonplace in this discussion, is how do you make this stuff? And, of course, you can't, there are no such things as hydrogen wells in the North Sea, or, hydrogen can be fracked out of tight rocks or whatever. You've got to produce it. And at the moment, the main way that hydrogen is produced is by a process called steam methane reformation, which is basically taking natural gas and cracking it into hydrogen and CO2. You've got a very pure CO2 as a result, which can have industrial uses. But once you produce that hydrogen, you've got just the same CO2 problem that you would have if you didn't start with hydrogen in the first place, i.e. you've either got to vent it into the atmosphere, in which case that adds to your emissions, or you've got to capture it. So hydrogen production by steam methane without carbon capture and storage is not a realistic proposition. The question then arises, can you make it by other means? And of course, obviously, the other main means is electrolysis, cleanest fuel out, as it were, that you get hydrogen and essentially oxygen, no small particulates, no NOx, no nothing. There you have a very clean fuel indeed. But the final question that then arises is, are we ever likely to have enough electricity produced, and by what means electricity being produced, in order to have sufficient electricity to produce the hydrogen we need for the purposes that I've described? And the answer probably is no, which is another reason why I think hydrogen is actually going to be a niche area of the energy economy rather than the mainstream. But I do think there's a lot of potential in developing electrolysis methods by looking carefully at the way we manage our electricity resources at the moment. So, for example, more than an insignificant proportion of the time, renewable energy, renewable electricity is constrained by the fact that when renewables are producing electricity, sometimes it's not required by the system, so the wind farm is told to go and feather its blades and turn them down. And actually, across the energy sector, we actually have a policy and balancing policy at the moment which involves constraint, and increasingly, for example, gas-fired power stations will reduce their capacity margins to fit in with a marginal role as a balancer for predominantly renewable electricity in the system. So we can see circumstances, particularly as far as renewable energy is concerned, where you can relocate the product of that energy directly to making hydrogen so that the hydrogen can then work its way into the system in the way I've described. Now, as our renewable capacity increases, then increasingly there will be availability of that kind of electricity to produce hydrogen on the margins. It won't produce enough hydrogen to run everything, but I would suggest it will produce sufficient hydrogen to carry out the sort of tasks that I've described in my earlier remarks. So my overall conclusion is this: there will not be a hydrogen economy, but there will be parts of the economy which have hydrogen at their heart, and I think it will be a very positive heart to have, particularly because of the, not just the zero carbon that effectively goes into the process, but because of the lack of other pollutants that come out of the process as hydrogen is used. So altogether, it's a good thing with a capital G and a capital T. The question is, can we develop it in such a way that it performs the sort of role that I've described alongside other forms of decarbonisation, so that it plays a full part in a low-carbon, decarbonised economy alongside other technologies, and takes its place as the cleanest fuel there is in that process. But it all depends, as I've said, on how you produce it, and that's, it seems to me, is the next task we've got to really get to grips with in the development of the hydrogen economy overall. And that's my lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't know how long we've got you for, so I'll ask you just one quick question to follow up on that. If production is the key enabler for system niches for hydrogen, is there anything that you've got in mind from a policy perspective to drive forward production, whether that's helping lower the cost of electrolyzers or CCS? What's the Labour stance on helping to stimulate the supply side?
Well, I mean, the first point in terms of post-combustion CCS anyway is that hydrogen is a product. So actually you could imagine, in the circumstances of some CCS arrangements, that actually you can run a hydrogen hub alongside those arrangements. So certainly what we want to do in terms of carbon capture and storage, which is really get us back on track in terms of the large projects that were cruelly axed by the last Conservative, or the coalition government to be precise. We need to get large-scale CCS back on track, and it is not a question of doing a whole load more research. We know how CCS works, we know how it works full scale. It's really a question of scaling it up and making it work. That then, of course, means that with CCS you also have CCS coming into play for intensive energy using industrial purposes, as well as what we thought of more traditionally as a way to capture the carbon from energy production. And it is at that point then you can contemplate ideas in the interim that you could put CCS onto methane production of hydrogen while you move to wider electrolysis. But the key on electrolysis is actually a refashioning of the balancing system across the UK for electricity supply, so that actually you can get a much better match between electricity that is produced at any time and electricity that is used at any time. And certainly we've got plans both to decentralise and to rebalance the energy system so that it liberates that capacity within the system, and so that the production of hydrogen can be substantially stepped up as a result. So these are fairly practical propositions in terms of how you move forward with getting the circumstances under which hydrogen can be properly produced and used. Of course, that doesn't solve the problems of actually using hydrogen, but it does mean that you've actually got a much better gateway to provide the wherewithal that hydrogen can play that relatively central role in the energy economy.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll hand over to Mike for what else we're doing in this
Yes,
in this
thank
space.
you. So, as Stuart started, for those of you who don't know what Alstom is, we're a transport solutions provider focusing primarily in the rail sector. So we produce everything to do with the rail requirements. We can give you a complete system. The reason we're here today is that we also last week put into service the first ever hydrogen trains, fuel cell powered trains operating in Germany. And so we are very, very interested in the hydrogen economy and how it may evolve. But we're looking at this situation from a transport perspective, talking about moving logistics, as some of the other speakers were, perhaps not from a holistic position of solving the heat issues. But in the transport context, as we heard, transport hasn't really moved so far on carbon emissions as other sectors have in the last 20-odd years. There are a number of factors involved. Perhaps the encouragement of car use continues to be a problem. But also, in the rail sector, for example, we're a relatively small component of the overall global transport emissions. And in some ways, that gives you a place to hide. I think now we all recognise, and there have been certain challenges made to the rail industry, that decarbonisation needs to be made across the piece. There's no point just doing one area and not the other. And so we have our part to play, and that's why we developed the Coradia Island, the German train. That train is a fuel cell powered train. It uses hydrogen. The fuel cell converts that into electrical energy, and that is used to drive the train and charge a battery, very much like a hybrid car that some of you may have. So instead of having a petrol engine or a diesel engine, you have a hydrogen fuel cell. And what that gives us is an alternative to the existing diesel fleets that operate in this country and many others. So the UK has the second largest diesel fleet in Europe, second only to Germany, so it's no coincidence that we may be following close on the footsteps of our German colleagues. And a lot of those diesel trains operate in areas which are not intended to be electrified. There's much in the news today currently about whether electrification should proceed or should not, and whether there are other solutions. These are complementary technologies. So hydrogen gives us the same potential for very low emission transport as do electric trains. And in combination, they can solve a lot of the needs of the rail network for the country. So we've heard a little bit of discussion about the production of the hydrogen and whether you have zero emissions or not. Even if you produce your hydrogen from steam methane reforming or such industrial forms of gas, and you don't indulge in carbon capture, compared to the diesel traction system you might have been using the train before, you'll probably halve your carbon emissions. You'll also get 100% reduction in the particulates and the various NOx and SOx that pollute stations, which is where our customers, the travelling passengers, board and alight the trains, and where many of our staff work. So from a health point of view, it's very positive. Moving forward, of course, you can always clean the technology that produces your hydrogen without needing to go back to the vehicle. In the same way as an electric car today is only as clean as the electricity produced from the grid that's used to charge it, a hydrogen train is as clean as the production of the hydrogen. But as the grid and as the production technologies improve, then the overall emissions of the transport system will diminish. So you can make a big step in the first instance, and then you can incrementally progress to a true zero emission proposition. So we think that actually that means that by harnessing hydrogen and deploying it in particularly heavy vehicles like trains, we have a very good route to a very low emission, if not zero emission, form of transport. You might ask why we've used hydrogen, not batteries. And the reason is, as I mentioned, heavy transport. It was referred to earlier that you wouldn't have a lot of space left for the amount of batteries that you would need to power a train over long distance. Typically, a hydrogen-powered train will cover 10 to 15 times the distance that a similar battery-powered train could achieve, given the space constraints for the power system on board. So with that in mind, it's a very logical solution for us to adopt. The reference to a seasonal battery is very relevant also for the rail applications. The seasonal battery is a good way of, or the concept of storing unused renewable energy is a great use for hydrogen, and in particular useful for transport, because we have a very forecastable level of demand in the railways. Issues aside with timetabling, what timetabling should mean is that we have a constant daily demand that is repeated day in, day out for years to come. That's a very good catalyst for the development of production facilities and for tapping into existing production resources in a way that is commercially attractive to gas producers to actually support. And in that way, I mean, for example, our German application is in the northern parts of Germany, and there they have a lot of onshore wind and a lot of curtailment of the energy, so they can produce more than they need, and they have to shut down the generation capability in order to avoid overloading the grid. If they were to use that energy or store that energy and capture it in a hydrogen form, it doesn't have to be fed back into the grid. It can be used for other purposes like transport. And so from that point of view, we think that the demand and the use of hydrogen could be very, very effective for railways. And a typical average wind turbine could generate sufficient fuel to drive probably 4 trains for a day, in a day. So you've got that kind of constant feed loop that could support a transport system. So I think from our point of view, our issues are slightly different to the bigger picture, but we do feel that the level of demand that transport, in particular in the rail transport sector, could create a predictable and constant demand. We think that that could support the sort of propagation of more hydrogen production in the UK and help to move the whole question of the hydrogen economy and the other uses for hydrogen forward in a way that could be very positive and help sort of redress the tardiness of the transport sector's start in this race.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike. Time are we on? I'll open up to Q&A in just a moment. I just wanted to ask Stuart, so in the transport side of things, the economics seem to be slightly more compelling in the sense that hydrogen fuel could be exempt from fuel duty, or it can be eligible for a renewable transport fuel obligation. What would you like to see on the heat side, if anything, to help on, make the economics slightly more compelling?
I think in the shorter term, what we'd like to see is at the moment you mentioned the RTFO, the renewable transport fuel obligations. We've got the renewable heat incentive on the heat side. I think there is a consensus that you need more low carbon gas, be it hydrogen or biomethane. So we would like to see that, rather than trying to work out what the right answer is today or tomorrow for the end use. You need to support the investment in that green gas. You need to get the facilities built. Maybe something like what happened in electricity, where you had a renewable obligation that you just you put an obligation on gas suppliers to produce percentages of green gas and hydrogen once we know we can inject it. For us, that might be a simpler way of getting that investment to occur earlier. How you then use it is sort of it could almost be decided further down the line. If you're injecting it onto the gas network, you have flexibility, and you can change your mind. You might use it for transport for 10 years, and then for heat. You've got that flexibility. But let's get the investment there first of the production facilities. The rest follows from that.
Excellent. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience. If you could kindly state your name and organisation and keep them to questions rather than statements, that would be appreciated. So, the lady here in the front and the gentleman behind in the glasses.
Fiona Dent, Runnymede constituency and National Policy Forum. It's a shame Alan's gone, because I wanted to ask, perhaps somebody else can answer for him, the current government policies on encouraging incinerators and fracking, how is that sort of distorting, progress in this area? And can we do something to change that if we get into government?
David Amos, Programme Director for the Islands Growth Deal, which is a development that Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles councils are all working on. My question was around the panel's view about where the sources of large-scale production of hydrogen you think that might develop. The islands have already got quite a bit of hydrogen production and use going on, really using stranded renewable energy that they can't export to the mainland at the moment. So quite a lot of small-scale testing and piloting of hydrogen uses in the islands. In fact, we can beat Mike's first fuel cell German train, that the first registered road vehicle to run on hydrogen was actually in Shetland a number of years ago. So it's something we've been looking at for some time, and the potential renewable resources that sit off either onshore or offshore the islands, and the fact that there is already very well established oil and gas distribution facilities and networks sitting in Shetland and Orkney. So whether you think that in the longer term, hydrogen production using that level of renewable energy that's available to the islands, feeding into the existing gas distribution facilities that sit within the islands' oil and gas industry, whether you feel that has some potential.
Thank you. Preference? Mike?
If I may, I'll answer the second question more primarily. I can't really comment very effectively on the first one from my perspective, but certainly from our point of view, the concept of capturing more of that renewable energy and utilising the type of scheme that you have, I think is crucial to what we're proposing to do. So as we are now undertaking, if you like, the development of the first product for the UK on rails. We expect to see the deployment of that linked into schemes like you describe. And there are various areas around the country that are sort of leading the way in terms of hydrogen production and the capability to produce hydrogen. There is quite a lot of installed capacity in certain areas, not in the renewable sector, but more out in the sort of industrial sector. But we have had, since it's become known that we are interested in this thing, it is amazing how many points of proposal have come to us from renewable providers using different schemes ranging from waste recovery right through to excess wind energy, tidal energy, that kind of thing, where you've got a very predictable output, particularly tidal, for example, but you can't necessarily match it to demand unless you've got an intermediate step. So I think that we will see that coming.
Stuart?
I mean, on the same point, I think that if you look at the gas network of today, over this winter on the 1st of March, in some of our networks we saw record gas demand. It was met. People stayed safe and warm in their homes. There's the expectation there that gas will be delivered. So if we move away from a natural gas network to a hydrogen network, you have to provide something that is similar levels of reliability and security. So if I was designing a hydrogen network of today, I think you would have to start off with big, reliable hydrogen production facilities like, as Alan mentioned, steam methane reforming or variants of that. I think over time, once you've got a hydrogen market, as I said earlier, I think that will drive innovation. Look at electricity. How we generate electricity now is very different than how it was 50 years ago. The physics are the same broadly, but the way it's made. Once you have that hydrogen economy, you might need to start by building these big steam methane reformers, but you've got a market, and the market will evolve and drive the lowest carbon solution. So I don't think you'd finish with SMRs, but you'd have to design something that gave people the reliability and security they need. On the first question about sort of fracking incinerators, I think as a gas transporter, we aren't allowed to choose where the gas comes from. We can't choose between fracking, Russian gas. We're actually breaking the law if we do discriminate. And again, I use the electricity analogy. National Grid don't decide whether they want to favour nuclear or wind or solar or gas. We have licence obligations to say we have to treat them all the same. Government worry about that, and we'll do what government's policies set down.
I would echo my panellists' comments really. I think there's a real regional opportunity, particularly around the northeast and Scotland. So if you think about the conditions you need to create hydrogen in the northwest, for example, or the northeast, you have 50% of already existing hydrogen production located there. You've got abundant location to abundant underground storage for carbon capture and storage. You've got existing expertise from the oil and gas industry. You've got a large amount of renewable energy located there, and incidentally that tends to be where a lot of the curtailment is in Scotland. So if you kind of amalgamate all the different things going on there, it points to a regional opportunity, whether that is production for CCS. You've also got heavy industry located there. So I don't think a decision to produce hydrogen should be based on one factor, whether it's just industry or lots of renewable energy, but there does seem to be a cluster of lots of different of these factors locating in or coinciding around the northeast. So I think that in particular for me is where there seems to be an opportunity. The gentleman behind in the red lanyard, and then the lady next to him.
Thank you. David Budd, elected Mayor of Middlesbrough. As you just mentioned, Joshua, more than 50% of the hydrogen in this country is made in Teesside as a byproduct of Teesside industry, and that could increase. But there's also a massive storage facility, which I think is really important. The whole point of the H21 ambitions for Leeds originally was to use something that's effectively just up the road to convert Leeds into a hydrogen city. That ambition has now moved on with the aid of Northern Gas Networks and others, with the idea that could cover the whole of the north with not necessarily a huge amount of investment required to actually create the hydrogen, which is there already and almost unused. So I think there is a virtuous circle in here somewhere or other. Yeah. It's not quite as simple as that, but I think that ambition goes beyond the 20%. Even if it's in a relatively limited area to start with, but I think that's where we perhaps could go.
Rachel Anderson, Assistant Director of Policy for the North East England Chamber of Commerce, covering Teesside. So we've got some skin in the game with this. What I wanted to ask was, there's clearly a need for infrastructure. We've been hammering away about industrial CCS since God was a boy, really, but now we're starting to get some reality around hydrogen, and we do produce a lot of it. Actually, there's going to be a need for skills development, there's going to be a need for a workforce development, but also around a supply chain, and it's how we go around developing that. All that seems to be being driven only under the devolution agenda at the moment, and maybe in the Northern Powerhouse agenda. Where do you see that there's any traction in Whitehall over this? And I say Whitehall rather than Westminster, because this seems to bounce from deck to bays to wherever it is this week. So I just see what do we do in terms of our lobby around getting a whole industry around this?
Stuart, what do you want to
I think the mood and music in Whitehall has changed. It feels to me in the last 6 months there is a lot more positive conversation about hydrogen. I might be just seeing what I want to see, but I do feel like that the momentum is in the right direction. We've had the carbon capture and storage task force talking about the need for 2 clusters by the middle of the next decade. And it goes back to my point that we need to start building things. We need to have 1 or 2 at scale carbon capture projects operational as soon as we can, and then move from there. So I think the mood music is changing. But you get into that point where you need the regulation and the funding to support actually building things.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. Obviously, that part of the world is of great interest to us in terms of deploying a fleet of trains. Anywhere with developed infrastructure is likely to be a better opportunity. The commercial environment around railways is a little bit complex, but that doesn't that doesn't necessarily prevent you doing things. You just got to be imaginative and dogged in doing them. So I think we welcome playing a role in that group to push for enhanced support for the sector. I think we'll do our bit. We'll try and generate as much demand for hydrogen as we can and demonstrate its use. And how it can be used, and that's part of what Germany is doing already. But then there will come a time when we all have to pull together in order to deliver something and make the most of it.
The only thing I'd add is that I think the current administration is quite keen to look at opportunities for export of IP, export of technology, for example. So if you take what's happened in the offshore wind sector, it's been a real growth in the intellectual export of that to other countries. So I think what it's hard to say exactly what's going on, but I think there is a interest in what are the opportunities to develop skills and expertise, but also technology. So that's whether electrolyzers or something, for example, is there an opportunity there to not just build a market for the UK, but is there an opportunity to develop expertise and equipment that could be exported elsewhere? So I think it's about the cost competitive side of things. Claire Perry always puts the 3 C's down. I can only remember 2. Carbon reduction and cost competitiveness, or competitive advantage. But I think there's a real change within in DEC or BEIS now, given the merger. It's not just looking about decarbonisation, but it's really looking about what are the opportunities to export. And I think that would be where you might be able to seek a niche. Gentleman in the scarf, and then the gentleman in the jacket.
Jonathan Cooper, Greenwich and Woolwich CLP, and a member of Equity. Methane is an even more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide that's being emitted from the melting of the permafrost. Would you agree that efforts to not just decarbonise but also cut out the emittance of methane is not only not nearly aggressive enough but needs to be stopped if we're going to avoid passing the point of no return?
Who wants to take that one first?
Happy to.
Stuart.
Yeah, we need to reduce methane leakage, and we've got incentives around our operation, and we've outperformed those, and we'll be talking to our regulator about what's the challenging set of targets to reduce our emissions from our networks. But as I said earlier, we can't carry on transporting natural gas and methane in the same way and hit our carbon reduction target. So there's short-term things we will continue to do to reduce the emissions today, longer term, but we need to look at things like hydrogen.
Anything to add?
All I would say is that in decarbonising the railway, you're not just decarbonising the vehicles that travel on it, you need to look at the entire operation. So we have massive facilities that need heating, we have massive facilities that need to be operated, vehicle fleets and other things. So we have to look in the round at everything, and we are doing so.
Hi, Mike Blaney from Hill and Knowlton. My question is, the government has thrown an awful lot of money in through the industrial strategy of battery technology, and they haven't done the equivalent for hydrogen, at least nowhere near it to the same scale. In this room earlier on, we had a big conversation about Britain's productivity and how we should get manufacturing going, and the sort of various ways that the UK can overcome some of the structural problems in the economy. It seems to me that hydrogen ticks a lot of boxes. It creates jobs in a region in Teesside and Scotland where jobs need to be created, where manufacturing has suffered. It seems that there's huge opportunities for it to have IP and export and become a leader in renewables. So why why is the government not doing it? Should the government be doing it? And obviously we don't have any representatives of the Labour Party on the panel, but what should Labour be doing to be pushing that?
Mike?
I think you're absolutely right. It's fair to say we're probably a little envious of the amount of effort thrown at batteries at the moment. It's interesting when you look at the KPMG do a big automotive industry survey every year just before Geneva Motor Show, and in their findings they reported that over 70% of global automotive executives expect fuel cell electric vehicles to be the end game, if you like, for road transport rather than battery electric. So probably why is the focus on batteries? I think it's just what's understood at the present time and what's conceived to be viable. And so I think we will see a move towards the sort of alternative technologies as people start to understand the scale of the issue and the context we've got to work in.
Stuart?
I totally agree with you. I've got 20 years experience in electricity, and I still remember when it suddenly dawned on me just how much energy the gas network delivers. It's 2.5, 3 times more than the electricity network. So as a start, you could just say, well, funding should be in proportion to demand. In terms of the reason why, I think the electricity network has gone through a huge amount of change with renewables, and the industry is used to dealing with that complexity. They're comfortable with the issues, they're comfortable with the framework. Whenever you get a new energy issue, they therefore look at it through electricity lens to start off with. And I think Alan mentioned it earlier. Until fairly recently, government policy was we're going to electrify heat because that electricity is the answer to everything. Once you start working through what the implications are and the practicalities of building another 2 or 3 national grids, suddenly you start looking at what the alternatives might be. So I fully agree with you. And we're pushing our regulator as well to say, let's have at least equal funding for things like innovation support.
Thanks. The only thing I would add is that I think that electrolyzers are probably a good place to start, and one of the suggestions that we put forward in our report last week was that electrolyzers or investment in electrolyzers should form part of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Funds. And so that's certainly where I'd place some of my investment if I was in the government's position. It has one of the greatest cost reduction pathways of all hydrogen production technologies because it's one of the newest, it's less mature, so there's a lot more scope to drive cost reduction there. So if government targeted investment specifically around electrolyzers, I think that would be quite a sensible way of focusing their money. And that goes back to the point I made earlier, it's also an opportunity there to export that around the world. So it's not, and it kind of filled the dual ambitions of the clean growth strategy and the industrial strategy. So for me, it would be the electrolyzers. Any more questions? The gentleman at the back of the blue shirt.
Hi, it's Tim Cowley from Tarmac. We transport a lot of bulk materials around the rail network in the UK, and I was wondering what your thoughts were around when viable hydrogen technology might be available to do that on the railways. And equally, are we missing out on any technology in the interim that could help decarbonise the network?
I'll go straight to you.
Yeah, that's a good point to raise. Most of the focus so far has been on passenger transport, and passenger railways. The freight sector is quite concerned about the stated target of removing diesel traction from British Railways by 2040. Primarily because the heavier the load, the more the energy you have to carry with you. It's very simple when you put it like that, but that's the storage and carriage of the hydrogen is the challenge if you're going to use fuel cell freight trains. Those have not yet been developed. There is quite a lot of development in terms of road goods vehicles, but they're obviously somewhat lighter than trains. I think there is a future for it. In the meantime, the obvious interim steps that could be taken are looking at diesel blending or biodiesels and other fuels like that to try and reduce the footprint, if you like, of those journeys before, unless or until a complete replacement system can be developed. That said, we are working on heavy deployments elsewhere around the world, and the technologies are transferable. So as soon as we've got that one sorted, I'm sure we'll be looking to deploy it elsewhere.
Anything to add, Stuart?
I think looking at HGVs are the supply chain is geared up in response to government policy to look at natural gas and renewable biomethane powered trucks with significant carbon and wider emission savings. So the solutions are there in that sector, although there's a risk that some of the policy might be taken away just as it's reached that tipping point to roll out at the next budget. So with HGVs, you think, well, is there an option for natural gas or biomethane for trains? Because the gas network's there, it can be delivered via existing infrastructure. And that's one of the attractions for HGVs. You don't have to sort of build a new infrastructure to transport it there. You can get it delivered via the existing gas network. So that's what I wonder whether there is an option as a pathway to longer-term solutions of using biomethane, for example, for trains.
Thank you. Take a last round of questions, if anyone has got any. In which case, I'll put a question to you, Stuart. I think there was, from our work anyway, and others, I think, suggest that the blending of 20% is probably a starting point, and to really deliver higher carbon savings, we need to move to 100%. So do you think that's possible to convert the gas grids back to hydrogen, given the last conversion that was commensurate with the present day challenge happened in a nationalised industry? Can we do that now when in a liberalised market?
Definitely, yes. And that's what the project that Alan referred to, H21, is looking at, what you need to do to convert the network. Technically, we know we can do it. We need to show that it's just as safe, if not safer, than methane. So yeah, we can definitely do it. I think one potential simplification could be if appliances, and we know that some of the companies like Worcester Bosch are developing flexible hydrogen boilers. So yeah, they can burn 100% hydrogen, but they can also burn blends. In an absolute perfect world, if you had a boiler that could automatically switch between sort of any blend of hydrogen and methane, then it would make the conversion process a lot simpler, because you could mandate those boilers to be fitted and then progressively evolve people over to higher percentages of hydrogen over time. At the moment, we're really looking at that sort of step change. We can get up to 20% with blending, but then you'd have to do a fairly hard switch over by converting areas to hydrogen one after the other. So technology may simplify it further, but even if it can't, we know we can do it. It's engineers love these sorts of things. They'll sort it out.
Thank you. On that note, unless there's any last questions, I'll conclude today by saying thank you for Cadent for putting this on, and thank you all for attending.